Hey guys, thanks for tuning into my channel today. I'm Ijeoma Kola and I like to combine beauty and brains with style and substance. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing how I got 3 Ivy League degrees with absolutely zero student debt. So if you're unfamiliar with my academic background, I have a PhD in Socio-Medical Sciences from Columbia University, a Master of Arts in Socio-Medical Sciences from Columbia University, and a Bachelor of Arts in History of Science from Harvard University. I also have a Master of Philosophy, but people don't really count that as a degree once you have your PhD. So I have 3 Ivy League degrees and I have 0 student loan debt, 0 private loan debt, 0 debt. Now, as a quick aside, I am married, so my husband does have some student loan debt. But in America, over 75% of college graduates have some form of student loan debt. I know that I'm super lucky to have completed all of my education without any debt whatsoever. I know that isn't the story for everyone, but hopefully there's some things that I might share in this video that can help you, whether you're thinking about applying to college, whether you're already in college and thinking about graduate school, or whether you're already in grad school and you want some creative ideas about how you can not have to take out additional loans for future semesters. Before I get started, make sure that you subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any more videos. I do have a whole playlist that has a lot of videos about my PhD journey. So if you're interested in learning more about the PhD, definitely check out that playlist. I will say one huge caveat. So my name is Ijeoma, I am Nigerian and Naija no de carry last, but I am an American citizen. I grew up in America. I went to all-American school. So if you have any questions about loans or financial aid for international applicants who want to apply to schools in America but are coming from schools outside of America, I can't help you. I have no idea what that process is. You should definitely seek out resources from elsewhere. So I'm going to start at the beginning, which is how I graduated from Harvard with my undergrad with 0 student loan debt. I was able to do this for 2 main reasons. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about Ivy League colleges is that they're incredibly expensive. A lot of American private institutions are very, very expensive, but the great thing about some Ivy League institutions and other private institutions that have a large endowment is that they actually have a lot of money to give towards financial aid. I was looking up some stats recently, and over 55% of Harvard students receive some sort of financial aid. So Harvard does provide need-based financial aid scholarships. Currently, if your household income is under $65,000, you won't have to pay any tuition, and if your income is between $65,000 and $150,000, they won't charge you more than 10% of your household annual income. So I do remember when I was starting college over a decade ago, my family had just missed the cutoff for completely free tuition. So we did have a tuition bill that we had to pay. But before I go into about how much we paid per semester, I want to say this. When you're applying for colleges, you always want to make sure that you apply to multiple schools because you can always use one school's financial aid package to negotiate and leverage at another school. This is exactly what we did. So I can't remember exactly which school, but one of the schools that I applied to had given me a completely full ride. Super grateful for that. So when Harvard said that we had to pay, I don't know, X amount of money, let's say it was $20,000 for the year, we were able to push back and say, hey, we would love to come to Harvard, but actually this other school is offering us a free ride, so what else can you do? And that's something that I don't think that everyone realizes. You can try and negotiate your financial aid package. And if they have it, schools will be flexible with you. Again, I don't remember the details, but based on that negotiation, I do remember that my first year of college, the expected family contribution was about $10,000. Now that's a lot of money for a lot of people, and in some situations, someone might have to take out a loan in order to afford that. I was extremely lucky to have parents who really valued education and are willing to sacrifice many things so that their kids could get the best education that they can afford. So for the 4 years that I was in college, I was really grateful and really lucky that my parents were willing and able to pay the balance and the expected family contribution after Harvard had given me whatever need-based financial aid that I qualified for. Now, being Nigerian parents, payments always came with stipulations, so I had to keep my GPA over a certain amount. They gave money for tuition, room and board, and books, and any other frivolous expenses that I wanted, I had to pay for myself. So for my freshman year, I worked as a research assistant, I worked as a babysitter, I did research studies. Anything else I wanted to buy that was outside of food in the dining hall and books for class, I paid for by myself by working while I was at school. I remember my senior year, I really wanted to go to Jamaica with my friends for spring break, and I saved up the entire fall semester, about $1,000, so that I could afford to go on this trip. And I know classmates of mine who, rather than working, took out additional loans on top of their student loans for everyday expenses, and I would highly recommend against that. For me, I would rather work during the school year to be able to afford extra things that I needed, rather than taking out a loan and trying to figure out how to pay for it later. That explains college. So I'm going to talk about my master's and my PhD together because I did both of them at the same time. I personally ended up going into a PhD program immediately after graduating from college. It was one of the worst decisions I've ever made in my life. If you want to hear more about that, there's a video called Why You Shouldn't Go Do a PhD Straight Out of College or something like that. One of the advantages of going into a PhD program directly without having a master's first is that you can often get a master's along the way. However, I don't recommend doing this immediately after college. I always advise people to work a little bit, save some money so that when you start school, and I'll explain why in a little bit, you have some pocket money, you have some savings to pay for things outside of tuition. So I was applying to different PhD programs. I kind of used the same thinking that my parents had used when I was going to college to negotiate funding for my PhD. I ended up going to Columbia for my PhD, and when they first gave me my offer, they offered me 2 years of funding. Now, every school, every single program, every single year is probably gonna have a different funding system. Grants change. A program honestly just might not have enough money for the people it's trying to accept. However, you should not get a PhD unless it is fully funded for the duration at which you will be at said PhD. For me, I knew that there was no way I was going to finish my PhD in 2 years, so I needed more than 2 years worth of full funding. Another school that I applied to had given me 5 years of funding, so I went back to Columbia and said, I really would love to come here, but unfortunately, I need 5 years of funding if I'm going to attend your school. And what did Columbia do? They turned it around and they gave me 5 years of funding. So again, make sure that you're negotiating when you're entering graduate school programs and undergraduate school programs to try and get as much money as possible. Second thing is that you always want this information written down somewhere, because if you don't, it can bite you back in the behind a little later. How Columbia presented the funding option to me is that for the first 2 years, I would be funded through a diversity training grant, and for the subsequent 3 years, I would receive my funding essentially by working as a research assistant. Another thing to note when you're negotiating funding is whether or not your funding will cover tuition only or tuition and a stipend. So for the first 2 years, I received tuition coverage and a stipend. Stipend was around $30,000. After those 2 years, I decided to apply for outside funding. So I think whether you are in college, in a master's program, or in a PhD program, you always want to be applying for outside fellowships, external fellowships that might be able to provide you extra money. Whether it's $5,000 here somewhere, $10,000, or $50,000, external scholarships and fellowships can really go a long way. So while I was in grad school, I applied for the Ford Foundation Fellowship, the NSF Fellowship, the Mellon Mays Fellowship, a whole bunch of predoctoral fellowships. I was lucky enough to get an NSF predoctoral fellowship, and so that's what I used to fund years 3 to 5 of my PhD program. By that point, I had finished with coursework, so part of that money went towards my tuition and my fees every semester, which is from around $2,000 to $5,000, and I was able to keep the rest of the money, which came out to around like $25,000, $26,000 a year. Now, if you've ever lived in New York City, $30,000 is a little rough to get by. So actually, starting in my second year of graduate school, I started working outside of school. Yes, I was doing research projects in school, and that's how I was earning my income through school, but I needed extra money. Something that people don't often realize about graduate school programs and paying for graduate school is that you don't just need money for tuition, you don't just need money for housing, but you need money for groceries, for going to the movies, for shoes, for a bag to carry to class. And again, for me, I just always thought it was better to work as hard as I can, make as much money as I could, so I can make up the difference between the stipend I was receiving from school and what I needed to get by. So my second year of grad school, I started doing hair. I had a little salon in my apartment. In my third year of graduate school, because I was classified as a research assistant at Columbia, I wasn't able to TA more than 10 hours a week at Columbia because they knew that I was also doing research assistant work, and they don't allow you to work over a certain number of hours. However, I also got a TA position outside of Columbia at a different university. So I was able to have 3 sources of income in my third or fourth year of graduate school. NSF predoctoral funding, the Columbia teaching assistant funding, and I also had CUNY teaching assistant funding. And that extra cushion not only allowed me to make up the difference so that I would have money for living expenses, but it also allowed me to save a ton of money to put towards our wedding, which is a completely different story about how we paid for our 300-person, really extravagant Nigerian wedding without any debt either. So that NSF funding carried me through years 3, 4, and 5 of my PhD program. I got my master's after year 4, so that explains how I got my master's without any student loan debt. But here's how I completed the rest of my PhD without any debt. So approaching year 6, I had no more funding from the NSF, and I went back to Columbia and kind of said, like, hey, remember you guys had offered me 5 years of funding, and I only used 2 years of funding because 3 of those years, I had done external funding, so can I have those other 3 years back? And they were like, it doesn't work like that. So when a school is offering you a funding package, make sure that you fully understand the scope of that funding package. If I had known that Columbia's offer for 5 years of funding only would be valid for my first 5 years, I would have deferred my NSF fellowship a year or 2 so that I could take advantage of Columbia's funding. But anyway, I'm in year 6 and I have to figure out how to pay my tuition and how to live. So I have 2 options. I can either take out a loan or I can find a job. But if I find a job, I won't have as much time as I need to write my dissertation, which allows me to graduate. So this is a really bad cycle that a lot of doctoral students find themselves in, where they don't have enough money to finish, so they work, but then because they're working, they don't have enough time to finish. It's just a really, really, really bad cycle, and sometimes explains why some doctoral students spend 6, 7, 8, 9 years in a program. It's a rant for another time. Being the person that I was, I knew I did not want to take out any loans, so I had to figure out how to come up with at least $30,000 a year to live on, plus the cost of tuition and fees every semester, which is about $5,000 because the cost of health insurance had gone up at this point. If this is your first time ever stumbling upon my channel, you probably might not know that I'm not only a PhD holder, but I also am a lifestyle blogger. I've been blogging since 2010, and I've grown my blog into a pretty successful business. A large part of the reason why I became a successful blogger was out of necessity. I had to pay for my last 2 years of school. So what did I do? I figured out how to better monetize my blog. I figured out how to increase my blog audience, and I really treated my blog as a business. It was a side hustle. It was actually a main hustle. It was my job. I did a lot of research on how to be a really good influencer and how to monetize myself better. I streamlined my processes and all these things. I talk a little bit more about how I became a 6-figure blogger in a blog post. If you want to know more about that, you can feel free to click the link down below in my description box. But I knew that I had to make enough money blogging in order to live and pay my tuition and fees so that I could finish graduate school. That's essentially how I finished my last 2 years. I paid out of pocket. Even though PhDs are supposed to be fully funded, even though I was promised full funding, I ended up having to pay those last 2 years out of pocket, but I was able to do so without taking out any loans. Which brings me to the completion of my schooling. So I finished my undergrad at Harvard, I finished my master's at Columbia, and I finished my PhD at Columbia. It was very grueling, but I managed to do all of that without taking out any student loans. So one big reason I was able to finish undergrad without any student loans was because of the help of my parents. If you don't have that kind of familial support, another thing that you can do is work odd jobs throughout the school year, or even work odd jobs in high school so that you save money that you can be applied towards tuition or room or fees or whatever additional expenses that might not be covered by the financial aid that your school gives you. But again, feel free to negotiate financial aid packages, and also always apply to outside scholarships. There's so many scholarship applications for high school students. It can really add up and be the difference between you going to school without any loans and you having to take out additional loans. Now in graduate school, I was too proud to ask my parents for help, so I had to financially navigate those 2 degrees completely by myself. One strategy that I used was actually negotiating my funding offer from the outset, getting Columbia to bump me up to 5 years of funding from the 2 years of funding that they originally offered. However, I didn't do a good job of really understanding the parameters of that funding, and by year 5, when I thought that I would still have some of that funding banked, it was no longer available to me. However, I didn't quit, and I essentially created a job for myself such that I would be able to afford my daily expenses as well as pay my extra tuition and fees. So that's how I got 3 Ivy League degrees without any student loan debt. Hopefully there's something in there that can help you as you're on your journey towards pursuing higher education, whether that's a college degree, a master's degree, or a PhD. As always, if you have any questions about education, about PhDs, about graduate school, feel free to leave them down below. I'd be happy to talk more about this. I think student loans are so unfair. I'm so passionate about living a debt-free life, and I really want to help just empower and encourage people to do anything that they can to not have to pay student loans. I have family members who still have student loans. As I said, my husband has student loans. So although it's not my personal struggle, I do see people around me having to deal with it and know the power and the pain of it. So if you can avoid it by any means necessary, try to avoid it. And if you can't avoid it, make sure that you vote people into office that will help reduce your student loan debt. But also seek out financial counsel on whether it's a good idea for you to consolidate your debt or do something else with it. I'm not the right person to talk to about that or to ask about that. But yes, just research all your options and figure out all of the resources available to you. So I'm glad I finally got to share this journey. I still think I need to do a video about from start to finish my entire PhD journey and the ups and downs of that, because it is quite a story, but I'm still slightly recovering from the trauma that was my PhD. But yes, you guys can stay tuned for that video and more coming up soon on my channel. Thanks so much guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.